Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff McCulloch.
Imagine a federal budget that's 2% of the economy instead of 25%. Imagine federal taxes so low that most people don't interact with the IRS. Imagine Washington as a sleepy southern town of a few thousand employees instead of a metropolitan center of millions. Impossible to imagine? Well, that wasn't some libertarian fantasy. That was America for 70 years. From 1789 to 1860, the United States actually lived under the system of enumerated powers that James Madison designed. The federal government really was limited, states really did dominate most policy, and somehow, imperfectly, with glaring contradictions that we will address, it worked. Until it didn't. This is the age before Leviathan. The era of dual federalism, when federal and state governments operated in genuinely separate spheres, when the Constitution's limits were real, not rhetorical. But this isn't a story of pure success or simple failure. It's a story of what Madison's republic looked like in practice, its strengths, its contradictions, and the seeds of its eventual transformation. I am Jeff McCulloch, and you're listening to the Consequential Actions podcast. And this is a special series from general welfare to the Great Society. Today, episode 2, Enumerated Powers and the Early Republic. Federalism before the fracture. So, the Constitution is ratified. George Washington becomes president in 1789, and immediately the Madison-Hamilton debate we explored last episode stops being theoretical and becomes practical. Because now they actually have to govern, and governing requires making choices about what this Constitution means. The first major test comes fast. Alexander Hamilton, now Treasury Secretary, proposes creating a national bank, the first bank of the United States. There's just one problem. The Constitution doesn't say Congress can charter a bank. Nowhere in Article 1, Section 8 is banking mentioned. So the question lands on President Washington's desk. Is this constitutional? Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, says, absolutely not. He writes Washington a memo arguing strict construction. The Constitution grants only enumerated powers. Banking isn't enumerated, therefore, no bank. Simple. James Madison, now a congressman, agrees. He warns that if you start inferring powers not explicitly listed, the enumeration principle collapses. Where does it stop? Hamilton writes his own memo, and it's brilliant. Let me walk you through his reasoning because it shapes constitutional law for the next 2 centuries. Hamilton says, look, Article 1, Section 8. Yes, it lists specific powers, but it also includes something called the necessary and proper laws. It says Congress can make all laws necessary and proper for executing its enumerated powers. Now, what does necessary mean? Jefferson and Madison say it means absolutely essential, something you cannot do without. Hamilton says, no. It means useful, appropriate, conducive to the goal. If it helps accomplish a constitutional end, it's necessary enough. And what are the constitutional ends? Regulate currency, collect taxes, pay debts, manage federal finances. A national bank helps accomplish all of those. Therefore, it's constitutional, not as an enumerated power itself, but as a means to execute enumerated powers. Washington sides with Hamilton, his former aide-de-camp. The bank is chartered in 1791, and Madison loses the first round. But the real constitutional showdown comes 30 years later, and it happens not in Congress, but in the Supreme Court. The case, McCulloch versus Maryland, decided in 1819, and here's the setup. The second bank of the United States, Hamilton's first bank, was rechartered and has a branch in Baltimore. Maryland, like the other states, does not like it. The state imposes a tax on the bank, trying to drive it out. The bank refuses to pay, and Maryland sues. Two questions reach the Supreme Court. First, can Congress charter a bank in the first place? Second, can a state tax a federal institution? Chief Justice John Marshall writes the opinion. And Marshall is a Federalist. That's a capital F, as in the political party. He believes in national power. This is his chance to lock Hamilton's vision into constitutional law. Marshall asks, is the bank constitutional? Well, he says, the Constitution grants Congress certain powers: coin money, regulate commerce, levy taxes, support armies. These powers must have effective means of execution. Then he writes one of the most consequential sentences in American law. Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. Hear what he's saying? If the goal is constitutional and the means are rationally related to that goal, Congress can do it. The Constitution isn't a straitjacket. It's a framework that permits implied powers. This is huge. I mean, Marshall has just transformed the necessary and proper clause from a limiting principle, you can only do what's absolutely necessary, into an elastic principle. You can do what's reasonably useful. Madison's fence just became rubber. But Marshall, it doesn't stop there. Maryland argued that even if the bank is constitutional, the state can tax it. States had sovereign powers to tax within their borders, right? Marshall, he says no, and his reasoning is even more important than the bank question. The power to tax, he writes, involves the power to destroy. Therefore, federal law is supreme. Where federal and state authority conflicts, federal wins. This is the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 of the Constitution coming to life. And it changes federal-state relationships forever. Now, from a libertarian perspective, McCulloch is complicated. On one hand, it expands federal power significantly. It opens the door to implied powers. Every later expansion of federal authority, from Social Security to environmental regulation, traces back to Marshall's reasoning here. But on the other hand, Marshall isn't claiming unlimited power. He's still working within the enumeration framework. The bank is justified because it serves enumerated ends. The means are expansive, but the ends remain limited, in theory. The problem, as we'll see, is that once you permit implied powers, the question becomes, what counts as plainly adapted to an enumerated end? Who decides, and how loosely can you interpret adapted? Marshall opened a door. Later generations, they would drive a truck through it. Five years later, 1824, the court hears another critical case, Gibbons versus Ogden. New York has granted a monopoly to run steamboats on the Hudson River. A guy named Aaron Ogden has the exclusive franchise. Another entrepreneur, Thomas Gibbons, starts running his own steamboat under the federal coastline license. Ogden sues. "You're violating my state-granted monopoly." Gibbons responds, "Your monopoly conflicts with federal law regulating interstate commerce. Federal law wins." The case reaches Marshall's court, and again, Marshall sides with national power. He holds that Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce is complete in itself. It reaches everything that affects commerce between states, not just buying and selling, but transportation, navigation, anything that crosses states' lines. New York's monopoly interferes with interstate commerce. Federal coastal licensing law conflicts with it. Under the Supremacy Clause, federal law prevails. Now, here's what's interesting. Marshall's definition of commerce is broad. He says commerce is intercourse, all commercial interaction, not just trade in goods, but the movement of people, information, and transportation. This matters because 70 years later in the Progressive Era, Congress will use the Commerce Clause to regulate railroads, then labor relations, then agriculture. Eventually, in 1942, in Wickard versus Filburn, the court will say Congress can regulate a wheat farmer who grows for his own consumption because it affects interstate commerce. All of that traces back to Marshall's broad definition in Gibbons. So again, from Madison's perspective, this is a problem. Marshall is supposed to be interpreting the Constitution, but he's expanding it. The Commerce Clause was meant to prevent states from interfering with trade, not to give Congress general police power. But in 1824, nobody worries too much because Congress doesn't actually use the power aggressively. Not yet. So by the 1820s, John Marshall's Supreme Court has established two principles. One, Congress has implied powers under the Necessary and Proper Clause. Two, Congress has broad authority under the Commerce Clause. These are Hamiltonian victories: constitutional elasticity, room for national action. But here's the thing: politics pulls the other way. While the court is expanding potentially federal authority, the political branches are restraining actual federal power. And that tension between Marshall's legal expansiveness and democratic political restraint, that defines the early republic. Let's see how that plays out. Thomas Jefferson becomes president in 1801. And Jefferson isn't just philosophically opposed to big government. He actively dismantles Hamilton's system. Jefferson slashes federal spending. He reduces the Army and Navy. He eliminates internal taxes. No more excise taxes on whiskey or other goods. Federal revenue comes almost entirely from tariffs on imports and land sales. He pays down the national debt. Hamilton had wanted to maintain debt as a way of binding wealthy creditors to the federal government. Jefferson sees debt as bondage. By 1812, he's reduced it by nearly half. And here's what's remarkable. It works. The economy grows, trade expands, the government still functions. Turns out you can run a country without elaborate federal machinery. Well, mostly. Because Jefferson faces a contradiction he can't resolve. Limited government versus national opportunity. In 1803, Napoleon offers to sell the Louisiana Territory. 828,000 square miles, doubling the size of the country, for $15 million. Jefferson wants it. Of course he wants it. It's an incredible deal. It secures the Mississippi River, removes a European power from the continent, and provides land for generations. But there's a problem. Where in the Constitution does it say the president can buy a foreign territory? Jefferson, the champion of strict construction, the man who opposed the national bank because it wasn't enumerated, now faces his own implied powers question. Jefferson writes to his advisors, "I'm about to exceed my constitutional authority. Maybe we should pass an amendment first. That's the right way to do this." But his advisors warn, Napoleon might change his mind. The deal could fall apart. You don't have time for an amendment. So, Jefferson does it anyway. He buys Louisiana, and maybe the greatest purchase in the history of the world. And then, somewhat sheepishly, asks Congress to ratify it after the fact. And nobody really objects because it's obviously good policy. Even the Federalists who oppose Jefferson don't seriously challenge the purchase. But the precedent is set. When Constitution's limits conflict with national interest wins, even for Jefferson. Now, let's talk about James Madison as president, because this is where theory meets reality in fascinating ways. Madison becomes president in 1809, and in 1812, the United States goes to war with Britain, the War of 1812. The war exposes how weak a limited federal government can be. Madison can't raise troops, militia service is controlled by states, and states don't always comply. He can't raise enough money. There's no national bank anymore. Jefferson let the charter expire. No reliable system of federal credit. He can't coordinate logistics. There's no federal infrastructure. Everything depends on state cooperation. The war, it's a mess. Washington gets burned. American forces are poorly supplied, poorly coordinated. The country barely avoids disaster. Madison learns a hard lesson. In war, you need national capacity. Limited government is a luxury that peace affords. So after the war in 1816, Madison does something interesting. He supports, reluctantly, rechartering the National Bank, the same institution he opposed as unconstitutional in 1791. Why? Because experience taught him it's necessary. The country needs reliable federal credit. The war proved it. This is Madison evolving, not abandoning principle, but recognizing that principle must accommodate reality. But he doesn't abandon restraint entirely. In 1817, just before leaving office, Congress passes a bill funding internal improvements, roads and canals. This is Henry Clay's American system, federal infrastructure to bind the nation together. The bill lands on Madison's desk. This is Madison's last act as president. He could sign it. Nobody would blame him. The country needs infrastructure. It's popular policy. But Madison vetoes it. He writes, "I think improvements would be wise policy. I think they would benefit the nation. But I don't think they're constitutional. The Constitution doesn't grant Congress general power to build roads and canals. If we want the federal government to do this, we need to amend the Constitution. Until then, this power belongs to the states." That's remarkable. Madison is sacrificing good policy for constitutional fidelity. He's saying ends don't justify means. Process matters. Limits matter. Even when the outcome would be beneficial. Now, you might think that's admirable, but isn't it a bit rigid? Maybe even impractical? And you wouldn't be alone. Plenty of people at the time thought Madison was being needlessly strict. But Madison saw something deeper. If you blur the lines between federal and state authority every time it's convenient, the lines eventually disappear.
In 1814, team, we took a little trip along with Colonel Packham down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon.
Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829. And Jackson takes restraint even further, though for different reasons. Jackson, he's not an intellectual like Madison. He doesn't cite Federalist Papers. He's a frontier general, a populist who distrusts banks, distrusts elites, and definitely distrusts concentrated power. In 1832, Congress passes a bill to recharter the second bank of the United States, and Jackson vetoes it. And his veto message is fascinating because it makes a constitutional argument Madison would recognize, albeit from a different angle. Jackson says, the Supreme Court ruled in McCulloch that the bank is constitutional, but the court doesn't have the final word on constitutional meaning. Each branch, legislative, executive, judicial, interprets the Constitution for itself. I am the president. I have my own constitutional judgment, and I think the bank is unconstitutional. Or at least, I think it's bad policy cloaked in constitutional argument. More than that, Jackson argues the bank represents concentrated private power protected by federal charter. It's anti-democratic. It serves wealthy elites. It's incompatible with Republican equality. Congress does not override his veto. The bank dies. Now, Jackson's not a strict libertarian. He expanded executive power in other ways. He used force against South Carolina during the nullification crisis. He removed Native Americans. He fought Congress over appointments. But on fiscal policy, on federal economic intervention, Jackson was more Madisonian than Madison. Federal spending stayed minimal. No infrastructure bills, no federal subsidies, no central bank. So here's the pattern from 1789 to 1840. Marshall's Court opens constitutional doors, implied powers, broad commerce authority, but politics keeps these doors mostly closed. Jefferson cuts spending, Madison vetoes infrastructure, Jackson kills the bank. The federal government has potential power that it doesn't actually use, legal capacity without political will to deploy it. That's the equilibrium of the early republic. And it holds for decades until modernity and moral reckoning breaks it. Okay, let's get concrete. What did the federal government actually do from 1789 to 1860? Because understanding limited government requires seeing it in practice, not just theory. Federal spending exceeded 2% of GDP in peacetime, or rarely exceeded. Let me clarify that. Rarely exceeded 2% of GDP in peacetime. So think about that. Today, it's about 25%. That's not a tweak. That's a completely different type of government. So back then, here's what the government did handle. 1, defense and foreign policy. Most of the budget, usually 50 to 70%, went to the military and debt service from previous wars. The federal government maintained a small standing army, a modest navy, and coastal fortifications. Customs and trade. Tariffs were collected at ports. This was the primary source of federal revenue. The government regulated foreign commerce and negotiated trade treaties. Post offices. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress the power to establish post offices and post roads. By 1860, there were thousands of post offices. This was actually one of the largest federal observances in everyday life. Public lands. The federal government surveyed and sold Western lands. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set up a system of territorial governance and eventual statehood. And this was federal policy, but execution was largely market-driven. People bought land, settled in it, organized locally. Coinage and currency. Federal government minted coins, though before the Civil War, private banks also issued their own paper currency, a banknote. It was kind of a chaotic system, but it was consistent with limited federal power. And then, of course, federal courts, which was a small federal judiciary handling interstate disputes, maritime law, and, of course, constitutional questions. And that's it, kind of. The federal government was, for the most part, in the 19th century, again, very limited in its scope. How about what the federal government did not handle? Education, entirely state and local. No federal Department of Education until 1979. Before the Civil War, education was mostly private or local. Some states had public schools, some didn't. No role for federal and national government at all. Infrastructure. States built roads and canals. The Erie Canal, the great infrastructure project of that era, completed in 1825, that was a New York State project. Federal government wasn't involved. Police power, criminal law, public health, moral regulation, all state level. No federal police force, no FBI until the 20th century. If you committed a crime, you answered to state or local authorities unless it involved federal jurisdiction like customs or counterfeiting. Welfare and poor relief. This was handled locally, often by private charities or churches. Some cities had almshouses, some towns provided outdoor relief, but no federal safety net, none. Labor regulation didn't exist. No minimum wage, no maximum hours, no workplace safety rules. Not at a federal level, barely at a state level. The employment relationship was considered a private contract. Economic regulation. Nope. No antitrust law until 1890, no securities regulation until the 1930s, and no federal oversight of industry. If you wanted to start a business, you didn't need federal permission. Now, this doesn't mean those issues weren't addressed. They were, just not by Washington. States and localities had their own laws, their own approaches. Massachusetts might have a different school system than Virginia. Pennsylvania might regulate differently than Georgia. New York might build canals while South Carolina didn't, and thus wasn't obligated to offer their citizens taxes to subsidize an out-of-state venture. That was the point. Federalism meant diversity, different solutions for different places. Sometimes that diversity was general pluralism, different communities trying different approaches. Sometimes it was cover for oppression, particularly regarding slavery, which we will address in a moment. Here's a concrete example that shows how limited federal power was. In the 1820s and 30s, there was a cholera epidemic. Thousands die, cities are overwhelmed. What does the federal government do? Nothing, because public health isn't a federal responsibility. Cities and states respond, quarantines, sanitation efforts, hospitals. The federal government observes, but didn't intervene. In 1837, there's a financial panic. Banks fail, credit freezes, unemployment spikes. What does the federal government do? Nothing. No bailouts, no stimulus, no Federal Reserve to provide liquidity. Jackson had killed the national bank. No unemployment insurance. The economy just has to work through it. Now, you can react to this in two ways. One, that's admirable restraint. Markets correct themselves. Government intervention would have made it worse. People are resilient and self-reliant. Two, that's cruel indifference. People suffered unnecessarily. Government had a moral obligation to help and failed. The truth, it may be somewhere in the middle. The economy did eventually recover without federal intervention, but people did suffer. And whether that suffering was necessary or avoidable, it's a judgment call that depends on your view of government's proper role. What's undeniable is this. For 70 years, the United States functioned with a genuinely limited federal government. It wasn't just rhetoric. The federal government really did leave most of life alone. Did it work? In some ways, yes. The economy grew dramatically. Population expanded west. Immigration surged. Technology advanced. America became prosperous and powerful. But there's a massive, glaring exception. A contradiction so fundamental that it would eventually tear the country apart. We need to talk about slavery. here's the uncomfortable truth. Madison's limited government required moral compromise. The Constitution that Madison helped write protected slavery in multiple ways. The 3/5 clause counted enslaved people for representation, giving Southern states more congressional seats and more electoral votes. The fugitive slave clause required free states to return escaped slaves. The ban on prohibiting the slave trade until 1808, giving the institution 2 decades of protection. And most fundamentally, the entire structure of federalism left slavery to the states. The federal government couldn't touch it where it existed. This wasn't an accident or oversight. It was the price of union. Southern states would not ratify a constitution that threatened slavery. So the Constitution didn't threaten it. Madison knew this. Jefferson knew this. They all knew it. And they, maybe begrudgingly, maybe reluctantly, they accepted it, telling themselves that slavery would eventually die on its own. The economic forces would make it obsolete, that future generations would solve what they couldn't. They were wrong. From a constitutional perspective, here's what's so devastating. The same federalism that Madison celebrated, the same limits on federal power that protected liberty in the North, protected bondage in the South. States' rights meant New York could free its slaves, but it also meant South Carolina could keep its slaves. And the federal government couldn't intervene either way. The enumeration principle, Congress can only exercise listed powers, meant Congress couldn't legislate against slavery in existing states, only in territories and interstate commerce. This creates bitter conflicts as the country expands west. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tries to balance slave and free states. It holds for 30 years, but creates a deep resentment. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 lets territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, popular sovereignty. It leads to violence, bleeding Kansas, a mini civil war. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declares that Congress can't prohibit slavery in the territories at all. The Supreme Court says African Americans can't be citizens, have no rights that white men are bound to respect. Each of these controversies exposes the fundamental problem. You cannot have a limited federal government coexist with a moral crisis that crosses state lines. Slavery wasn't a local issue that could be left to the states. It was a national question of justice. And Madison's Constitution was built to avoid national answers to such questions. Now, here's the libertarian reckoning with history, and it has to be honest. Limited government serves liberty only when states also respect rights. When they don't, restraint becomes complicity. Negative liberty, the freedom from interference, it rings hollow when it means federal government won't interfere with state-sanctioned slavery. Frederick Douglass himself escaped from slavery and made this point powerfully. He said the Constitution could be interpreted as an anti-slavery document, that its principles of equality and liberty condemned bondage, even if its compromises permitted it. But he also acknowledged that practically, constitutionally, the federal government's hands were tied by its own limits. By 1860, this contradiction is unsustainable. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency on a platform of preventing slavery's expansion, not abolishing it where it exists, but keeping it contained. That's too much for the South. 7 states secede before Lincoln even takes office. And the Civil War, when it comes, doesn't just settle the slavery question. It shatters the constitutional order Madison designed. The federal government fights a total war, conscripts soldiers, prints money, imposes an income tax, suspends habeas corpus. It spends more money in 4 years than the previous 70 combined. Federal power grows by orders of magnitude and never shrinks back. After the war, the Reconstruction Amendments fundamentally rewrite the Constitution. The 13th abolishes slavery. The 14th makes federal government the guarantor of individual rights against state violation. And the 15th protects voting rights across racial lines. These amendments shift the constitutional center of gravity. The federal government is no longer just securing liberty by staying out of the way. It's now changed with actively protecting rights, even against state governments. Madison's dual federalism, separate federal and state spheres, give way to something else, something more complex, where federal government has power to override states when rights are at stake. This is necessary, it's morally required, but it also breaks the Madisonian framework. Once you grant the federal government power to secure equality, where does that power end? What counts as necessary to secure rights? Those questions will echo for the next 150 years. Even before the Civil War, modernity was straining Madison's system. In 1790, America was 13 states on the Atlantic coast, 4 million people, mostly farmers. Communication took weeks, travel was by horse, manufacturing was limited. By 1860, 33 states from Atlantic to Pacific, 31 million people. Railroads crossed the continent. Telegraph connected cities instantly. Factories hummed in the north, cotton plantations in the south fed global textile markets. The economy had integrated. What happened in one state affected every other state. Financial panic spread by telegraph. Railroads created interstate commerce that dwarfed anything the founders imagined. And industrial accidents killed workers whose families had little to no recourse under state law. Could Madison's framework handle this? Some say yes. States could still regulate within their borders. Interstate commerce remained federal. The system was flexible enough. Others say no. National markets require national regulation. Interstate problems need interstate solution. State-by-state approaches create confusion and inefficiency. The answer probably is, it depends on what you're trying to regulate and what you value. For simple coordination, railroad gauges, postal rates, federal standards made sense and fit within the enumerated power. For economic justice, labor conditions, monopoly power, it's less clear. These affected interstate commerce, but they also involved moral questions about how society should be organized. And here's what was coming. Though people in the 1860s didn't fully realize it, the progressive era of the 1890s and 1920s would bring demands for federal regulation of industry, labor, food safety, drug purity, and trust busting. The First World War would demonstrate that the federal government could coordinate the entire national economy when necessary. The Great Depression would create overwhelming political pressure for federal intervention in banking, agriculture, employment, and retirement. Madison's republic was built for a simpler time. Whether it could have adopted to modernity without abandoning its core principles, that's a question history didn't give us time to answer. Because the Civil War came first, and after that, the Constitution was never the same. So, that was the era of enumerated powers in practice. From 1789 to 1860, the United States really did live under a limited federal government. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't solve slavery within its own logic, and it was straining under the pressures of industrialization and continental expansion. But it was real. Federal spending stayed low. States dominated policy. The Supreme Court occasionally expanded potential federal power, but politics kept actual power restrained. This is the baseline, the original constitutional order. Everything that comes after, it's measured against this. Next time, we'll see how the Civil War and Reconstruction shattered that baseline. We'll explore the 14th Amendment, how it transformed the Constitution from a pact among states into a charter of individual rights enforceable by the federal government. We'll examine how industrialization and national markets created pressure that dual federalism couldn't contain. And we'll meet the Lochner Court, the judges who tried to protect economic liberty while tolerating racial segregation, creating contradictions that would haunt constitutional law for generations. That's episode 3, Reconstruction, Industrialization, and the Rise of a New Constitution, a Second Founding. Until then, think about this. Could the Madisonian Republic have survived modernity? Could enumerated powers have adapted to railroads, telegraphs, national corporations, and mass immigration? Or was the transformation we're about to explore inevitable? There's no simple answer, but understanding what we had helps us evaluate what we became. Thanks for listening. I'm Jeff McCulloch, and this has been From General Welfare to the Great Society on the Constitutional Actions Podcast. Constitutional Actions? How about Consequential Actions Podcast? Should get the name of my own podcast correct. Thank you very much, and please subscribe if you enjoyed listening to this. Bring other people into the fold. We appreciate it. Have a great day.